Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast, the podcast all about the delicate balance between people and business, and quite literally reconnecting the two. My name is Tracy Rubin, and I've spent nearly my entire professional career in HR. Join me as I share stories, opinions, and words of advice with you each week. Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for another week. As you can see, I'm figuring out this new video format. I'm recording in a place that allows me to include some fun things on screen. And I have actually some exciting news to share with you that I want to get to actually just in the beginning here. I don't want to dangle this carrot in front of you and tease you with it. I'm going to tell you exactly what this exciting news is. I work for the company Legion Technologies. I used to use Legion as a customer in my old retail job, where I actually brought Legion as a vendor for us. And now I work for Legion as the Director of Employee Engagement. So I'm really excited to share that I am going to be hosting a podcast that is brought to you by Legion Technologies. So just when I thought I had enough on my plate with this podcast, I added a second podcast to my repertoire. And that podcast is called The Frontline. So I will link it. The Frontline is really a podcast showcasing the challenges that the hourly workforce experiences day in and day out. And not just the challenges, but really talking about the reality for these frontline, get it? Frontline employees, because there's so much, and I know I've talked about it before on this podcast. I'm really excited that I can help bring Legion's mission alive, because our mission is to turn hourly jobs into good jobs. 58% of working eligible Americans are hourly. So I think Legion is really impactful on the majority of Americans and people across the world. And I think that this podcast is really going to allow, people who are either hourly workers themselves or leaders within, various industries who influence the hourly experience or the hourly workers experience. We'll be able to hear from those individuals and really get a sense of understanding. So the podcast, the Frontline podcast, will have episodes every other Thursday. So if you want to hear me more than once a week, and maybe you're fully caught up on all of my episodes, now you can hear me on Tuesdays and you can hear me on Thursdays. And naturally, the Frontline will be able to be streamed, listened to, watched anywhere you consume podcasts, just like in the places where you consume this podcast. So I'm really excited for that. I think it's going to be a worthwhile endeavor. And, I'm excited that podcasting has become such a big part of my life. So thank you for supporting me through this entire journey. The very first episode will be June 9th, but there is a trailer out that you can listen to. When you get the chance, please subscribe. This week, I want to talk a little bit about how individuals can become more adaptable. I've talked about this before on the podcast, that being resilient, being adaptable is probably one of the best things that you can be or that you can develop as far as like a skill set goes. And I mentioned adaptability and resilience because life is hard. And I know for sure I've spoken about this before personally, or, even with a guest on, that when you're dealing with a lot, humans deal with a lot, right? We're all bringing our whole selves to work. I always talk about this. We're not, one person here and one person at work, or one person at work and another person in our social lives or personal lives. We are bringing our whole selves, our entire selves to the workplace. And it's a lot, right? Like there's a lot going on in the world. There's a lot to almost like swallow and like deal with. And for us as human beings, like there's only so much that we could take, right? But the reality is that work will always be work. There's always going to be stuff going on at work that potentially frustrates us, that potentially makes us mad, that potentially irritates us. And that's compounded when you have stuff going on in your personal life. So I wanted to talk about adaptability and resilience because I find, especially like thinking back on my retail career, that was what separated people between like making it and being highly promotable and growing, and people who just kind of stayed in the same place. So let's break this down. Let's say you are a person that is, coaching, like an HR leader that is coaching another person. And this other person is really struggling to find like sense in it all. There's a lot of change. Maybe they're resistant to change. They don't like change so much. We have an obligation, an opportunity to call out that they have a need and an opportunity to be more adaptable. So, what does that mean? Being adaptable essentially means that you can go with the changes, go with the flow a little bit. It doesn't mean that you say yes to everything. It doesn't mean that you are non resistant to change, but it does mean that you are open to it. In my opinion, this is my interpretation of adaptability. And not only that you're open to change, but also that you are able to actually adapt to that change. So when something happens, when change happens, that you grow with it, that you figure it out, you problem solve if need be, and you kind of just make it work. And resilience to me means, or I interpret it to be, that you are resilient to change, meaning if when change happens, that you're intrinsically, inherently a bit more open to it, and you're not pushing back as hard. You don't feel that friction point as much when you are resilient to change. But also, the resilience is being able to kind of pick up and go when the change happens, because it's so much of an attitude as much as it is an action. Both of these words, resilience and adaptability. It's not just a way of being, it's a way of acting. So, taking that into consideration, think about a time when you were confronted with change. Think about a time when someone told you something that was changing or shared a change with you, and maybe you weren't super happy about it. Did you get stuck in the mud, or did you kind of move along with the change? Did you ask questions and then adapt and then become resilient after the change? Or did you ask questions, become defensive, fight it a bit, resist it a bit, and struggle to adapt or to be resilient to that change? That description hopefully can help you decide or determine whether you're more adaptable and resilient or whether you're less adaptable and resilient. And it's not to say that everyone is one or the other. You can be a blend of both. Obviously, when it comes to certain things, you might be more adaptable. When it comes to other things, you might be less adaptable, right? So, to become more adaptable, more resilient, I want to share a few tips. And I say this because actually I find myself to be pretty adaptable, pretty resilient. And I think it's because of my upbringing. We just had to be that way. And if you read my recent article, which came out, I was interviewed by Karen Mangia, who you might hear from on this podcast, if you know what I mean. She wrote an article for medium.com, Authority Magazine, and I was the interviewed party. So I will link that if you haven't read it yet. If you're connected with me on Instagram, you probably saw me post about it. But in there, I talk about how I have a sister with special needs. And I've talked about it here on the podcast too. But part of that, part of when I think about my upbringing, that reality, realizing that, you don't have control over everything in your life. My sister having Down syndrome, not her decision, not my parents' decision either, right? And so when you realize that you actually have to relinquish a lot of control when it comes to life, you naturally become more resilient and more adaptable. So I'm grateful for that experience in so many ways, obviously, other than just having an amazing sister. I also have these wonderful learning moments that I take away. And so I share this all because, I'm sure that we all come from very, very different backgrounds, but we can take things from our backgrounds that teach us different lessons. So, to give you some tips that I've learned to be more adaptable and resilient, one is to realize that you can't control everything. Even though I had this learning experience from an early age, it did take me a little while to realize that I can't control everything. Part of that, I'm sure, is psychological, that I feel like I need to control things because so much of my life has been out of my control. But everyone's life is out of their control for the most part, right? There's so much going on that we don't control. This is just my interpretation of myself. What I have learned is that, over time learning this, is that you can't control everything. And so when I think about this in business and in employee experiences and in HR, there are certain things that you can control. And when you control those things, the things that are outside of your control become a little bit more predictable. I don't want to say that they become more controlled, because I really don't think that you can control everything, even the things that are influenced by the things you can control. I think that they just become more predictable. For example, when you provide managers with um, sensitivity training, diversity, equity, and inclusion training, they will naturally become more understanding of the importance of having sensitivity in the workplace, of inclusivity, of uh, diversity and equity, for example, right? It doesn't mean they're going to prioritize it, but it means that they will be more understanding. And we hope, the thing that we can't control here, is that people will make cognitive decisions that support diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and things like that, right? If someone just doesn't have the same values as an organization, you can't control that, with the exception of hiring differently, right? If that is the way the business wants to go. But what I'm trying to showcase here is that when you provide training, you can, even the things that are uncontrollable, like the way that people act, the way that people behave, you can influence those behaviors by giving them more information. And so the thing you can control could potentially influence the thing you can't control, and therefore make it more predictable, right? So we can predict that if we provide really thorough training, that those managers will become stronger leaders. So that's the kind of connection I'm trying to make here, that the things you can control, you should control. The things you can't, you got to let go of. And when I say let go, it's more of like the thought process. Like, don't overwhelm yourself and stress yourself out to control the things that you can't control. Another tip when it comes to adaptability and resilience is that you need to be open to the change. When we are resistant to change, it's going to be harder for us to adapt to that change, to understand why things are changing, and then to be resilient to that change. I'm going to use another example. If someone comes to you as an HR person, let's say it's your leader coming to you and says, "Hey, we are going to have to, I don't know, reduce the organizational structure and lay off some individuals," let's say, right? Like, I've shared with you that I've had this experience before. um, that is not going to be something you're excited about, right? Like, you're going to be more resistant to the change. Naturally, everyone would be, because that is not a fun part of our jobs. However, being understanding of this change and being resistant to it are two different things. So we can be understanding and upset. We can be understanding and angry. We can be resistant and angry, resistant and upset, right? But if we are understanding and we ask questions, then we are informed in the change and of the change. And so now, instead of being unadaptable or unresilient, you are being thoughtful about the change. And there are definitely individuals who, might hear this example and say, well, that's not really a change. It's just kind of like something outside of our control, right? It is. Oftentimes, changes are outside of our control. The way that we adapt to that kind of change, which can be shocking and upsetting, is what makes all the difference. This episode is brought to you by Namely. We all do our best to keep ahead of business trends, but keeping ahead can be its own full-time job. With everyone wearing multiple hats, it's easy to fall behind. That's why you need to make the switch to Namely, the all-in-one HR solution that adapts with your business. And get this, Namely was honored as Stevie Award winner in 2022 American Business Awards. They won the 2022 Excellence in Customer Service Award, and they were declared a finalist in the 2022 HDI Servant Support Awards. So Namely helps you and your team with all aspects of HR, from onboarding and performance management to payroll and intuitive benefits enrollment, whether you have 50 or 1,000 employees, all in one connected and modern platform. Plus, Namely is customizable for your company, culture, and goals, so they can match where you are now and adapt as you grow. Grow with Namely. Learn more about making the switch today by going to namely.com. And for a limited time, get 1 month free when you make the switch to Namely. Don't wait, that's namely.com. So, understanding this example is maybe a little bit of a stretch. Let's just go with it, right? The more you are open to hearing the change that someone is bringing to you, the more easily you'll be able to think clearly about the questions you need to ask, to understand the reasons why, and then to be able to roll out that change. Now, this is the critical part of this example. When it comes to changes that we're not super excited about and that maybe we're less resilient to, less adaptable with, it's going to be harder for us to champion that change. And it's not to say that anyone should champion when someone is being laid off, right? That is not the connection I am making, just to be clear. What I am saying is that generally speaking, when there is a change, we have to champion it, or we have to execute it, we have to roll it out, right? And we have to be able to do so with the answers that we need to the questions that will be asked. And we need to be able to do so where it's clear that we are in support of that change. It's not to say every change is going to be change that we support or that we're excited about, but we do have to kind of put the business first, right? We're often in that position. And, there have definitely been times where there are changes that I don't agree with. And maybe it's, when I roll it out, it's like, listen, I get it. Not a change we're excited about, but here's the thing, right? And then you can be transparent about how you feel, but at the end of the day, you have to execute the change, right? And so coming back to this understanding that there are things outside of our control, there are things that we will never have control over. This is a perfect understanding, right? That there are going to be things that we have to roll out, that we have to execute. And if we are not championing those things, or if we're not understanding of the change, it's going to be that much harder for us to do our job. So again, it's not to say that we champion every change, but it is to say that we have to be open to changes in general in order to be able to roll them out in a thoughtful way where we've already thought about the questions that people will ask. So maybe outside of that layoff, example, I would say another example is when the business changes. Maybe there's a change in the way that the business operates, or a change in leadership, maybe a change in organizational structure. Someone goes to another team, for example. Those changes are outside of your control potentially. So how are you going to deal with it? And so when you have employees who struggle with change or struggle to be adaptable and resilient, these are the conversations that you should have. So this is another set of tips for you. First is to understand why they're so resistant and lacking that adaptability and resilience. And it might just be that they don't understand why there's change. And this is why explaining the whys as a leader, as an HR person, is so important. When you explain the whys, you're giving the person the most opportunity to be open to that change. The second thing that you should talk about in this conversation with someone who is maybe less resilient and adaptable is that we are unfortunately not fully in control of every single thing that goes on, but what we can control is how we react to it. And when there is a change that we don't necessarily agree with or that we're not happy about, we have to be able to ask the right questions, but then also adapt to that change. We have to be part of the solution. You guys know I always talk about that. We have to be in the right frame of mind, and we have to have the right attitude in order to even be part of that change. And I've had a lot of conversations with employees in that way that, hey, change is not easy. This change might specifically affect you, but we have to get behind it. We have to have the right attitude. You can disagree with it. We can have constructive conversations, but we have to, at the end of the day, be part of the solution. And this solution is this new change. So, explaining the whys again is one of the best, most important things, in my opinion, that you can do as a leader to either support someone who is struggling with the change, or initially when rolling out the change, to ensure that people are understanding of what is at stake and what's going on. Again, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast, but also don't forget to subscribe to the new podcast that I am hosting, The Frontline. I will link everything in the show notes as usual. And again, thank you so much for being here for another week. I will see you next week.